From the story, 1856 is most terrifying secret the sisters who served human flesh veil of history. In the cold, rolling hills of the Ozark Mountains, where the trees grew tall and dense and the roads turned to mud after the rain, there was a stretch of winding trail known by the locals as Devil's Hollow Road. It wasn't marked on most maps. Travelers took it only when desperate, for it cut a full 2 days off the long journey to St. Louis. But that shortcut came with a price, whispered only in taverns and around the low embers of firewood. Some said the woods were cursed, others spoke of bandits, wolves, or worse. But by the year 1856, one thing was certain. People had begun to disappear on that road, vanishing without a trace, as if swallowed by the trees themselves. And at the heart of it all stood a modest, creaking, timber-framed building with a crooked chimney and a swinging sign that read simply, "Whitlow in warm beds and hot meals." It was run by 2 sisters, Martha and Eliza Whitlow. The Sisters of Smoke and Silence, no one quite knew where they came from. Some said the sisters were originally from Tennessee, orphaned in the Great Fever of 1849. Others believed they had simply appeared one day like ghosts, quiet, pale, and oddly formal. They were not cruel nor friendly, just efficient. Martha, the elder, was stern and practical. She spoke only when needed, wore dark woolen dresses, and ran the books. Eliza, younger by 7 years, had a softness to her, a sweet voice, rosy cheeks, and hands always dusted in flour. She was often seen tending to the fireplace, stirring stew, or hanging herbs in the window. Travelers rarely stayed more than a night. The food was filling, the beds were warm, the price was fair, yet something always felt off. One guest, a trapper from Kansas, wrote in his journal, "Fine supper, room smelled of meat though, not pork, something else, can't place it, slept light, dreamt of knives. He never made it home, a place that ate people by late 1856. The town of Waverly, just 30 miles north, began to whisper. Farmers reported wagons left abandoned in the woods. Traders never returned from their routes. A post rider vanished mid-delivery. The numbers didn't lie. More than 24 people had gone missing on or near Devil's Hollow Road within the span of a single year. But it was frontier life. People disappeared all the time, drowned in rivers, froze in the mountains, were taken by bandits or bears who could prove anything, yet there was a pattern. Each of the missing had told someone before leaving that they planned to stop at the Whitlow Inn. That was the last place they were seen. Still, the sisters remained untouched. Their fire always burned, their stew always simmered, and then came Josiah. The unwanted orphan. He arrived in spring, barefoot and silent, no older than 10. Local rumor said the sisters had taken him in out of kindness, but those who saw him said the boy rarely spoke, rarely smiled, and often stared at the cellar door like it would open on its own. Josiah was put to work in the kitchen, cleaning floors, carrying wood, and occasionally feeding chickens. But it was what he saw and what he heard that changed everything. Late at night, beneath the floorboards, there were dragging sounds. Heavy chains, sloshing, sometimes the faint sound of weeping, and always, no matter how fresh the meat delivery, Eliza insisted on using what she called the special stock. Josiah didn't know what it meant at first. Until one night he watched Eliza carry a man's boot, still full of bone, to the fire pit behind the inn. She threw it in without hesitation. The flames crackled, and she sang a hymn as she stirred the pot inside. The darkness underneath the inn was more than a rest stop. It was a trap. The sisters had become hunters, wearing petticoats and pouring tea, using kindness as bait. The cellar beneath the inn wasn't for food storage. It was a butcher's chamber with hooks, drains, and salted flesh hanging like ham. No one ever questioned the taste of the stew. The sisters always offered seconds, but Josiah saw what others couldn't or wouldn't. And though he was a child, trembling and hungry, something inside him refused to stay silent. That would make all the difference. The Ozark forests were never truly silent. On most days they hummed with rustling leaves, the chirr of crickets, the chatter of squirrels. At night, the hoots of owls or the distant howls of wolves created a chilling yet natural soundtrack to frontier life. But on the path leading to Devil's Hollow Road, the air was still. Travelers often noted it. Long before they saw the inn, before they even turned the bend near the ancient cedar tree, the forest grew unnaturally quiet. Birds disappeared, wind vanished, footsteps once crisp on dry leaves became muffled, as if the very earth refused to echo sound. It wasn't peace, it was foreboding. This was the silence of a place that had seen too much, something the animals knew. Animals, wild or domestic, have an instinct humans often ignore. Horses, especially, would resist the pull of the road toward the Whitlow Inn. They'd buck, rear, or stop entirely. Farmers reported livestock growing anxious when moved near the hollow. One male carrier recalled his hound whining and hiding under the wagon just a few hundred yards from the inn's boundary. The question wasn't what had happened, but how much had. The forest seemed to have absorbed generations of evil, soaking it in like rain. The soil beneath Devil's Hollow Road was dark, almost black. Trees grew twisted, reaching like claws toward the sky. Some locals refused to chop wood from the area. They said it burned too fast and smelled wrong. Whether it was superstition or something older, even the bravest woodsmen agreed. This was a place that had grown used to blood. What Josiah learned from the trees, the boy Josiah had lived at the Whitlow Inn for nearly 3 months when he first began to understand the silence. Not just around the inn, but within himself. He wasn't allowed to speak much. Martha liked quiet. Eliza smiled more, but even her kindness came with one rule: never speak of the cellar, never speak of the guests. So Josiah learned to listen. He listened to the rhythm of boots coming and going, to the kitchen knives scraping bone, to the sighs Eliza made when a guest complimented her stew, and most of all to the woods. That stretch of forest around the inn became a barometer of evil. When guests were safe, the birds returned. When something terrible happened, silence, total, suffocating silence. He once tested it. After overhearing a guest planning to leave early the next morning, Josiah slipped out after dark and climbed a tree across the road. He waited and listened. The moment Martha opened the cellar door beneath the inn, the woods froze. Not a single insect chirped. A deep, primal hush rolled through the trees like a wave of fear. Even the moon seemed to dim. That was the night Josiah decided he could not stay silent anymore. A village that didn't want to know. Back in the nearby town of Waverly, strange rumors circulated, missing travelers, bones found in the river. A man who returned half-crazed, refusing to eat meat again. Yet few were willing to confront the Whitlow sisters. They were, after all, ladies, churchgoers, civilized. What could 2 women possibly do? One storekeeper, a devout old man named Luther Beck, once told a constable, "Ain't right up there in those woods, but folks don't want truth. They want comfort, and comfort don't live on Devil's Hollow." So the village stayed silent. That silence, too, was a kind of forest, dense, shadowed, and impossible to move through unless someone lit a fire first. Breaking the hush, Josiah began leaving small signs, carved arrows on fence posts, rocks stacked in odd shapes. One time he slipped a guest a crude drawing of a meat hook with the word "run" scrawled beneath it. The guest looked at the boy, confused, then left that night. He never came back. And that perhaps saved his life. Still, Martha grew suspicious. Eliza more withdrawn. Josiah feared the cellar would soon open for him, and then the miracle happened. A traveling preacher, Reverend Samuel Traska, arrived during a thunderstorm. He was bold, curious, and observant. He asked too many questions. Josiah took the risk and whispered to him everything. The next day, the preacher left, promising to return with help. He did, 3 days later, with 2 marshals and 5 townsfolk. What they found in the cellar made grown men retch. Bones, teeth, journal pages describing curing methods, clothing torn and stained, and yet, even then, the woods remained silent. The truth in stillness. The Whitlow sisters were arrested without resistance. Eliza cried. Martha said nothing. Josiah was taken to Waverly, given clean clothes and a new life. But even years later, when he'd become a teacher and told no one his story, he never walked into a forest alone again. He always listened, because he understood something most people didn't. When the woods go silent, it's not always peace. Sometimes it's a warning, and that lesson, the ability to feel danger in stillness, is one he carried for the rest of his days. The boy who spoke up the Whitlow Inn was not just a place for weary travelers. It was a trap, a masquerade of civility. Most who entered never walked out. But of all the souls who crossed its warped doorstep, one would change the course of its macabre legacy forever. His name was Josiah Miller, a quiet orphan boy of barely 11, whose courage would awaken a village and expose a horror that silence had long protected. Josiah had no family left. His parents had died in a fire in 1855, and a church in Waverley had placed him under the care of the Whitlow sisters, believing their isolated inn was a peaceful haven for recovery. In truth, it was a house of secrets, one so well kept that even the law avoided asking questions. When Josiah first arrived, the inn seemed peculiar but manageable. Martha was stern and controlled, always watching him with sharp, unblinking eyes. Eliza was warmer, often smiling gently and calling him our sweet little helper. But kindness at the inn was a mask that slipped too easily. It didn't take long for Josiah to realize something wasn't right, especially about the cellar. He was never allowed down there. The warning signs he couldn't ignore. Josiah began to notice things that didn't belong in a respectable inn. Boots by the back door that didn't match any guests, a guest book that skipped names, cooking smells that grew fouler each week, and always the odd silence from the woods. But it was one night, during a winter storm, that confirmed his worst fears. He had woken to the sound of muffled cries. Curious and concerned, he crept down the stairs, barefoot, careful not to alert Martha. From the hallway, he saw her drag a man's coat into the cellar, along with something wet and heavy. She was humming a hymn. The next day, the guest's horse was gone. Martha claimed he'd left early. Josiah knew she was lying. From that day on, he barely slept. Courage born in quiet places, Josiah didn't speak much. But he watched, listened. He began tracking the patterns, which guests arrived, how long they stayed, and whether they left. He counted shoes, noticed who was offered meat stew and who wasn't. Each time someone vanished, Josiah marked it down on a piece of paper hidden beneath a floorboard in the attic. He knew that speaking up could cost him his life, but he also knew that silence was a slow death all its own, one that would consume not just him, but others. He couldn't let it go on. One morning, he found a young woman guest, Miss Clara from Boston, reading in the parlor. She was kind and curious. She treated Josiah like a child, not a servant. That's when he decided, if he was going to speak, he would speak to her. The whisper that saved a life when Eliza sent Clara out to gather snow for cooling milk. Josiah followed her outside. The woods were cold, but not as dangerous as what waited inside. He handed her a folded piece of paper. On it were just 5 words: don't eat, don't stay, run. Clara stared at him, confused. What does this mean? She whispered, but Josiah simply shook his head and ran back inside, trembling. He didn't need to explain. If she believed him, she would go. If not, he feared he'd never see her again. That night, she vanished. Martha claimed she had gone on her way, but Josiah noticed her trunk was still in her room. The next morning, Martha began boiling bones. Josiah's heart cracked, but he never gave up. Finding the right voice 2 weeks later, a traveling preacher named Reverend Samuel Trask visited the inn. Josiah recognized something different in him. He wasn't intimidated by Martha. He asked questions, he noticed things, and unlike other guests, he prayed before every meal and never touched the stew. Josiah waited until Eliza left the kitchen, then slipped a note into the preacher's coat pocket. Guests disappear. Meat is not from animals. Please help. Reverend Trask said nothing that night. But the next morning, he took no breakfast, thanked the sisters politely, and rode out of Waverley with an unreadable look on his face. 3 days later, he returned with the law. A voice that changed everything. The authorities raided the Whitlow Inn. The cellar was opened. What they found shocked even the hardiest men: human remains, butchered tools, journals with cooking instructions for human flesh, teeth tucked into jars, and names of travelers no one had seen again. Martha Whitlow was arrested on the spot. Eliza wept as they dragged her out, mumbling about preserving what God gave. Josiah stood silently at the top of the stairs, watching the horror unfold. not with fear, but with relief. He had spoken, and someone had listened. The lesson the village never forgot Josiah was taken in by Reverend Trask's family. He grew into a thoughtful, brave man, a schoolteacher who taught children more than history. He taught them courage. Sometimes, he'd say, all it takes is one voice, even if it trembles, even if it whispers. When the world turns its back on evil, someone must stand up and say enough. The town of Waverley never forgot the boy who spoke up. And the woods on Devil's Hollow Road, they finally began to sing again. By the spring of 1857, the whispers in Waverley had turned into anxious murmurs. Something had broken the air of peace that once settled over the sleepy New England town. It wasn't the weather, nor was it the economy or politics. It was the unspoken fear that the horrors discovered at the Whitlow Inn weren't just the workings of two twisted women, but symptoms of a deeper sickness hidden in plain sight. But what truly fractured the illusion of innocence was not the discovery of bones or butchered journals in the Whitlow cellar. It was the confession that followed, a confession so powerful it would tear open the soul of the town and force every citizen to look in the mirror. And it didn't come from the sisters, it came from Sheriff Abel Granger. The weight of denial. Sheriff Granger had been a fixture in Waverley for nearly 3 decades. He was a man people trusted, the type who tipped his hat to every widow and helped lift wagons from mud with his bare hands. But when the Whitlow case broke and the cellar's secrets were exposed, Granger's posture changed. He no longer walked with the same confidence. He stopped attending church. He avoided the inn site, which had since been boarded up. What no one knew was that Sheriff Granger had been living with a secret, and it wasn't just about negligence. It was something far worse. He had known, not everything, of course, but enough. A letter left on the church steps on a gray Sunday morning, as the townspeople gathered at the old stone chapel. Reverend Trask found an envelope left under the church door. It was unsigned, sealed in wax, and addressed simply, to be read aloud, for the good of all. Inside was a handwritten letter. The ink was shaky but deliberate. Reverend Trask, unsure what it meant, took the pulpit as the church filled with the usual congregation. After the opening hymn, he cleared his throat and said, "There are times when truth must walk naked through our streets, though it chills the spine. Today, I have such a truth to share." And then he read the letter aloud. The sheriff's confession to the people of Waverley. You trusted me. For years you believed I protected you, but I carry a guilt heavier than any badge. I knew something was wrong at the Whitlow Inn. I knew it when travelers went missing, when stagecoach drivers whispered that their passengers never returned from Devil's Hollow Road. I even received reports, more than once, but I ignored them. I waved them away. I told myself people wander, that the sisters were strange, not sinister, that murder doesn't happen in our town, but I was lying. To you and to myself. The truth is, I was afraid. Afraid to confront what I suspected, afraid of scandal, afraid of disrupting peace. So I did what cowards do. I did nothing, and in that silence people died. I ask your forgiveness, though I do not deserve it. I stepped down from my post. Let justice find me too. As Reverend Trask finished the last line, a hush fell across the church. No one moved. No one whispered. It was as though the town had been punched in the gut. Sheriff Granger, seated at the back in full uniform, rose slowly and removed his badge. He placed it on the pew and walked out without saying a word. A town's reckoning. Granger's confession hit harder than the sisters' crimes. Why? Because it exposed everyone's complicity. How many townspeople had felt something was off, but said nothing? How many had turned a blind eye to stories that didn't add up? How many thought they were preserving peace when they were simply avoiding truth? It wasn't just Granger who had been silent, it was the whole town. That day marked a turning point for Waverley. A town once proud of its orderliness was now confronted with a painful reality. Evil thrives not just because of action, but because of inaction. The silence had fed the slaughter. Redemption in the light. Granger didn't run. He stayed in town, helped dig graves for the victims when their remains were identified, and volunteered to work the fields, though no criminal charges were brought, because cowardice is not a crime. He lived as though repenting every day. But more importantly, the town changed. The townspeople created a new motto: silence protects no one. They established a system for reporting concerns. The local church expanded its outreach to travelers. The town elected a new sheriff, young Henry Delac, who swore to listen first and judge nothing too quickly. The lesson that echoed beyond the confession of Sheriff Granger became a story told across New England. It wasn't the tale of monsters in the woods. It was the story of a man who buried truth out of fear and the cost that came with it. His confession may have shaken the town, but it also became the catalyst for change. A reminder that truth, no matter how ugly, must be spoken, that justice isn't only about catching villains, but about never letting fear dictate silence. And in the heart of Waverly, where the inn once stood, they planted a tree. A plaque beneath it reads, "Here stood the place where evil hid behind silence. Let no one be silent again." In every town haunted by tragedy, there's a name that history almost forgets, but shouldn't. For Waverly, that name was Josiah Bellamy, a farm boy, a wanderer, a child whose courage saved a town from permanent darkness. While the headlines remembered the Whitlow sisters for their atrocities, and Sheriff Granger for his delayed guilt, the true hero of Waverly's most terrifying secret was a 14-year-old boy with blistered hands, a stuttered voice, and a fire in his chest that refused to die. Josiah had no reason to interfere. He had no badge, no authority, and no one expecting him to take a stand, but what he did have was a secret and a choice: to carry it in silence like so many before him, or to speak and risk being ignored, mocked, or worse. Punished, he chose to speak, and that changed everything. The uninvited witness Josiah didn't live in Waverly. He was an orphan from Dunstable, sent from farm to farm for labor during the harvest seasons. He arrived in Waverly in the fall of 1856, taken in by the Larkin family, who owned a small cornfield just 2 miles from the infamous Whitlow Inn. The boy was quiet, rarely looked adults in the eyes, and spent most of his free time in the woods sketching birds in a leather notebook. One late evening, returning from gathering firewood near Devil's Hollow Road, Josiah saw something no one was meant to see: a man, struggling, limping, being dragged by the 2 Whitlow sisters into the inn's back cellar door. The man's hat fell, his shoe came off, then the door shut. Silence. He stayed frozen in the brush for an hour, convinced his eyes had betrayed him. The Whitlow sisters were odd, yes, but murderers. The next day he returned. The shoe and hat were gone, no footprints, but Josiah knew what he saw. The boy who knocked on the sheriff's door. It took Josiah 3 days to gather the courage. He walked barefoot across town to Sheriff Granger's office. When the sheriff finally agreed to see him, Josiah tried to explain what he'd seen, but his stammering made it hard. The sheriff, half listening, dismissed it as a boy's fantasy. "You spend too much time in the woods," he chuckled. "Devil's Hollow will fill your mind with shadows." But Josiah wouldn't give up. He drew what he saw: the cellar door, the man's twisted leg, the shape of the sisters' silhouettes under the torchlight. He left it on the sheriff's desk and said only, "Please don't wait till it's too late." He left unheard, but the drawing stayed. When others wouldn't, he did. Rejected and heartbroken, Josiah could have stayed silent. But he didn't. He began talking to townsfolk, asking questions, listening for stories. A baker mentioned her cousin went missing after staying at the Whitlow Inn. A blacksmith recalled an argument outside the inn late one night, but assumed it was a drunk. A stable boy said he once heard screams in the woods, then convinced himself it was foxes. All of them had pieces of the truth, but no one had connected them. Josiah did. And then he did the unthinkable. He stood in front of the church one Sunday, hands shaking, and told the town what he had seen. He raised his voice, he stammered, he cried, but he didn't stop, and slowly the faces looking back at him changed from disbelief to dread, because some of them already knew. They just didn't want to believe it. But now they couldn't ignore it. Truth in the face of fear, that public confession, delivered by a trembling boy with no social standing or adult protection, broke the seal of silence. The sheriff, realizing the boy's drawings matched his own vague suspicions, reopened the case. This time he went to the inn. He demanded entry. The sisters resisted. A search followed, and everything spilled out: the cellar, the bones, the meat that wasn't from pigs, the journals that mapped out dates and names. Dozens of missing travelers, all of it lying beneath the town like a rotting secret waiting to be spoken into the light, all because of Josiah, a boy's name etched in time. Josiah didn't want glory. He stayed silent during the trial, refused interviews. When offered a reward, he asked instead to be sent to school. Years later, he became a writer, an author of children's books, and eventually a teacher. He rarely spoke about Waverley again, but the town never forgot. Today, a stone stands near the old Whitlow cellar site. On it is carved, "In memory of Josiah Bellamy, the boy who saw, and the boy who spoke. Let no truth be silenced again." The legacy we must remember. Josiah's legacy isn't just about courage. It's about speaking up when you're not supposed to, about raising your voice even when it trembles. He reminds us that silence can be deadly, that the smallest voice can be the one that saves the many. The world doesn't just need warriors and kings. Sometimes it needs a boy with torn shoes, a sketchbook, and the bravery to say, "I saw something, and it's not right." And in that moment, he didn't just break the silence, he became history's echo. This tale is not just about cannibalism or crime. It's about how evil often hides in plain sight, behind politeness and tradition, and how courage doesn't always wear a badge or carry a weapon. Sometimes it wears worn shoes. Sometimes it speaks with a stammer. Sometimes it's just a child whispering, "This is wrong." And sometimes that whisper saves lives.